Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. I'm glad to have this intimate but enthusiastic crowd for our very special guest speaker, who happened to be coming through Mississippi. And when I found that out, we had to have him here, even though the university is not in session, and we're just a few days away from our graduation ceremony. But we're very, so I'm Jason Solinger, and I'm an English professor, and my son is in the front row laughing. And I am the faculty advisor to the University of Mississippi Hillel, and I'm also one of the board members of the Jewish Federation of Oxford, which supports Jewish cultural life and religious life and Jewish life in Oxford. And we have partnered with the Meek School of Journalism and New Media to bring Jeff Goldman, who is an amazing person, a journalist, veteran newsman, CBS News producer, just recently retired, and he's giving talks around the country, reflecting on his career covering presidents from Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton. Stop laughing, Eli. Barack Obama, and of course, President Trump. And this is a man who's covered presidential elections, national disasters, natural disasters, national disasters, international conflicts. He's seen a lot, and he's going to give us, I think, a really interesting insider's point of view today. And we're just so grateful for having him here in Oxford. And so I'll give it up for Jeff.
So before I start, I have to give a special shout out for a dear colleague of mine at CBS who just surprised the heck out of me here, Randall Pinkston, who's in the back there, who is a native of Yazoo County, Mississippi. And I remembered that as I've driven around the state, starting in Gulfport, going to Hattiesburg, Jackson, Greenville, and finishing here. And when I saw Yazoo City going in the direction of Greenville the other day, I said, I think that's where Randall's from. And he walks up on stage here. He's just doing some teaching there this summer at Ole Miss. And so that's a great treat to have him here. A gentleman I met on the speech in Hattiesburg told me to say something to you all by way of a special greeting that I had never heard of, but I now have learned, hotty toddy. Randall, you know about that, right? Okay, good. Anyhow, I thank you all for coming tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. For the past 40 years, I've been in front of the camera, behind the camera, and now I stand in front of you to share some of the biggest stories that I've covered in recent decades. My career started not too far east of here, over in Birmingham, Alabama, where I was something of a novelty there as the Jewish guy on the air at the NBC affiliate. My news director decided I should use the name Scott on the air. That's my middle name. So I was Jeff Scott, Newswatch 13. You like that, Randall? I bet you never heard that. My colleagues all knew I was Jeff Goldman. One day I was doing a story in downtown Birmingham about the loss of business there to suburban shopping malls. We interviewed merchants up and down the streets about the new economic problems that they faced. One merchant in particular stands out in my mind. He was a jewelry store owner with a rather obvious name, like Izzy Cohen. At the end of that interview, Mr. Cohen, who had a very heavy Southern accent, looked me up and down and said, "What'd you say your name was again?" "Jeff Scott." He said, "I don't see any Scott in you." With that, my cameraman started laughing so hard he nearly dropped the camera on the ground. I said, "You're right, Mr. Cohen, it's Jeff Scott Goldman. It's great to meet you." He said, "I knew it. I'll see you in Temple." And we did. Well, 40 years later, much has changed, of course, and I'm very happy to be Jeff Scott Goldman. After working in Birmingham, I then worked at local affiliates around the country covering the news before moving back eventually to Washington, D.C., where I worked for the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour on PBS for 12 years, and then moved cross town to the CBS News Washington Bureau, where I worked for 21 years before retiring recently. I've had the honor and privilege of covering 6 American presidents, starting with the second term of Ronald Reagan, all the way through the beginning of the Donald J. Trump administration. Each president, of course, is rather unique to cover. Some get along with the press well, some not so much, as we see today. In fact, I covered President-elect Donald Trump during his transition to office. I was one of those reporters that was sent to New York, to the famous Trump Towers, to stake out the elevator banks there. I watched people coming and going, vying for position in the new administration. One of the very first people through the door there to see the president-elect, Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions. I called out, "Senator, are you interested in taking a job in the new administration?" He said he'd be delighted to. And of course, now he's Attorney General, at least for now. I had almost daily interaction with the likes of Kellyanne Conway, who couldn't seem to get enough of being with the press. That wasn't exactly the case with son-in-law Jared Kushner, and certainly not with Steve Bannon. Those two darted in and out of the Trump Towers continuously, making sure they stayed well clear of the press corps. There were some unusual visitors to the Trump Towers in those early days to see the president-elect, like game show host Steve Harvey, and even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. For those of you that don't know, RFK Jr. is one of those that believes there may be a link between childhood vaccines and autism. Seems the president-elect had some special interest in that. It was during the campaign that I saw then candidate Trump start attacking the press verbally. I didn't witness it in firsthand at that point because I was out with President Obama, who of course was stumping for Hillary Clinton. Then one day I got a full dose of it when now President-elect Trump did a special campaign runoff rally over in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, for the GOP Senate candidate with the rather unusual name of John Kennedy, and of course he won. At that rally, President-elect spoke glowingly about Mr. Kennedy, and then suddenly pivoted and started attacking the press verbally. I was in the back of the room by the camera platform taking notes on the event, and when he uttered those words, suddenly the crowd of about 2,000 people started turning around and booing and jeering the press corps. I had never experienced anything quite like that in my 40 years in this business. That same hostility continued the very next day, and of all places, an airplane leaving Baton Rouge. The man across the aisle from me saw my CBS luggage tag and started mouthing off at me. I clearly knew where he was getting his cues from. On Inauguration Day, I was in the so-called press pool. For those of you that don't know how the press pool works at the White House, there are 5 networks, of course, and each day of the week, a different network takes a turn in alphabetical order. They go with the president close up in the bubble, whether the president's traveling around the world on Air Force One, around the United States on Air Force One, or just to cover things at the White House. There's no real competitive advantage to being in the press pool on those days because all editorial information and all video that your camera crew shoots up close with the president, including any impromptu comments the president may make, is shared at the exact same time with all 5 networks. That's why, for example, if you're flipping channels back and forth and something big's going on, at the exact same moment, you'll see the comments by the president played out. It's all coordinated to be fair because there's not enough space for the larger press corps to be close up with the president. Luckily, on January 20th, Inauguration Day, it was CBS's turn in the rotation, the press pool. So I got to cover the last hours of President Obama in office and the first hours of President Trump coming in. That day started out by the press pool being summoned to a photo op in the Rose Garden. There, through the windows of the Oval Office, we saw President Obama penning a letter to incoming President Trump. When he finished that letter, he left it on top of the Resolute desk. Then, for the very last time, President Obama left the Oval Office. He opened up the French doors and walked out onto the colonnade. As we watched him from the Rose Garden as he was walking along, frankly, President Obama looked lost in his thoughts. I called out, "Mr. President, are you feeling a bit nostalgic right now?" He looked down and paused and looked up, and he finally said, "Of course." A few minutes later, he was joined on the North Portico by Michelle Obama, and the two of them greeted the Trumps as they pulled up in the motorcade for the very first time. The two couples retreated inside for a ceremonial tea before going up to Capitol Hill for the oath. I was in that motorcade when they left the White House going to the Capitol, and I remember as we left the White House driveway, we pulled out onto Pennsylvania Avenue, and there, in front of the White House, all the bleachers were set up for reviewing and watching the grand inaugural parade. I remember saying to my cameraman, "Look at those bleachers, they're really kind of empty." I had no idea that the very next day, crowd size would become such a big issue. After the oath was administered, we were back in that motorcade coming down Pennsylvania Avenue with our brand new president. When we got to the White House, of course, President Trump took his place in the reviewing stands to watch the parade. At its conclusion, the press pool was summoned to the Oval Office for President Trump's very first photo op as president. There, he signed an executive order to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, a much touted promise of his campaign, and this was to get the ball rolling. At his side, Vice President Pence and, of course, son-in-law Jared Kushner. No rest for the weary, we were summoned back to the motorcade a short time after that. This time we were going off to the inaugural balls that evening. There were 3 of them. And as that motorcade sped through the streets of Washington, we passed a lot of bars and restaurants. The sidewalks were crowded that Friday night, but the crowds on those sidewalks were decidedly hostile when they saw the presidential motorcade. When it drove by, they booed and jeered. Some even offered one-fingered salutes. But it was an entirely different scene at the D.C. Convention Center, where thousands of people were gathered to cheer on our new president and first lady. It was a formal affair, black tie, and even the press was requested to dress accordingly, and we did. So picture the scene. There I was in my tuxedo, crouched low in front of the podium here to take notes so as not to block the view of people behind me. President Trump started his remarks, glowing remarks about the election victory and what lay ahead. Then suddenly, for the first time as president, he started beating up on the press verbally. As I was taking notes, I glanced back at that crowd standing above me, and they were looking at me and some of the other members of that small press pool with looks of disdain and contempt. You know, every administration, Democrat or Republican, finds faults with print articles or broadcast stories. And believe me, they let you know about their displeasure, whether it's to the individual correspondent or the organization that they work for. But never before have we had such a broad brush attack on the press in a very public way and almost a daily basis. Of course, reporting must be factual. It must not be biased. In campaign years, in fact, when I was out with members of both parties campaigning for president, I didn't vote in those election years. I felt I was too close to it and wanted to keep my neutrality. The overwhelming majority of journalists have great integrity. This whole thing hits very close to home for me. You see, I've lost friends who have been killed in wars just doing their jobs. I've known others who have lost arms and legs being blown up in improvised explosive devices in far-off places like Afghanistan or Iraq. I've been shot at a number of times. Unfortunately, wasn't wounded. But great sacrifices are made by the women and men of the journalism profession today to keep us all well informed about the world around us. Of course it bothers me to be booed and jeered at an event and having that behavior condoned from the top. But we need a free press. People now tend to only watch a cable news network that most aligns with their editorial points of view. Young people, some of you here, may not be reading newspapers, not watching traditional evening newscast. They're relying on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, blogs for their news. That sure wasn't the way it was when I started covering the second term of Ronald Reagan. Back then, Reagan was interested in improving relationships or making an opening with then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. In fact, in 1985, I went on Air Force One with Reagan to Geneva, Switzerland for their very first summit meeting. They had their first session, and afterwards, there was a total news blackout. Neither side was talking about what had transpired, and the world was clamoring for an insight of what had transpired. I had heard that Jesse Jackson was in town that day with a group of human rights activists, and they were outside of the Soviet consulate in Geneva. So I decided to take a chance and grab a camera crew, go over and see what that was all about. When we got there, we were the only Western press there. Suddenly, Jesse Jackson and the group, along with us, was invited into that consulate. I thought maybe they were going to offer up some low-level Soviet official to talk with Jackson and the group. We got in the lobby and were there for about a minute or so, and suddenly the doors fling open. And much to my shock, who walks in? Mikhail Gorbachev himself. I knew we'd have a network exclusive in the making there, because for 45 minutes, Gorbachev spoke with Jackson and the group, along with us standing at their side, cameras rolling the whole time. At the appropriate moment, I called out to Gorbachev, how are you getting on with Reagan? What's transpired in this first session? Through a translator, he said, we are for open doors. This was a new era of glasnost, a new Russia. When that session ended, I ran out of that consulate as fast as I could with videotape in hand, back to the International Press File Center, where my bosses at McNeil News Hour at the time were having a meeting, pontificating about who they were going to invite as a guest on the show that night to discuss this very important First Step Summit. I interrupted and said, hey, I just got an exclusive with Gorbachev on camera. Their jaws dropped. They couldn't believe it. Soon the other networks found out that we had this exclusive tape, and they were all clamoring to get a piece of that videotape to put on their broadcast. You know, Ronald Reagan was a look-good, feel-good president. He could deliver a marvelous teleprompter speech, and he had a very good sense of humor. But sadly, near the end of his second term, he had great trouble in taking impromptu questions from the press. I wondered then, and I wonder to this day, if that perhaps was the beginning of his struggle with Alzheimer's. Of course, he didn't acknowledge he had that terrible disease until 4 years after he left office. He, of course, was replaced by George H.W. Papa Bush. He was one of the few vice presidents to become president. And he had perhaps the most impressive resume in our lifetimes going into the office of president. But he may be remembered most for the following words: read my lips, no new taxes. And perhaps the Gulf War. As a foreign affairs producer at McNeil News Hour, I was dispatched to Baghdad, where we were tasked with getting interviews with the Iraqi leadership about why they had invaded Kuwait and taken over that sovereign country. It was a very dangerous time to be there. Western men were being taken as human shields and placed at strategic sites around that country to keep the Americans from bombing. I remember going into Baghdad with about $20,000 in cash and crisp $100 bills. Sounds like a nice chunk of change, but not when you consider no credit cards were accepted and the official government exchange rate was out of whack with reality. To give you an example, 4 sandwiches and 4 Coca-Colas cost the equivalent of about $250. At that point, I knew our money wouldn't go far and it would curtail our abilities to stay and report in Iraq. I came up with an idea. Well, maybe I'll go to a grocery store and buy some food. We'll eat our meals in our hotel room, make the money stretch a little more. Sure enough, I found a grocery shop by the American Embassy and prices were a little better. So I said to the young man behind the counter, "I'll be back. I need to go get more change." "Change," he says. "Yeah, I need to get more Iraqi dinar." With that, the kid yells, "Papa!" Barreling down the steps, this big burly guy comes towards me. I'm nervous as heck. You see, nobody knew where I was. And if these people find out that I'm American, I'm toast. They're going to haul me off to one of these strategic sites and I'll be a hostage. Papa looks at me. He says, "What country you come from?" I shook and I stammered and finally I blurted out, "Sweden." His eyes got big. "Sweden, very good country. I used to work there. Beautiful women. I change money for you, but you no tell. We changed money, and I ran back to the Al Rashid Hotel, where my then colleague, Charlene Hunter Galt, awaited. Charlene was really upset with me because I had been away so long. She, in fact, thought that I had been nabbed, and I was taken away to one of those sites. I said, "Charlene, look, I'll make it up to you now. I'm sorry to upset you, but how about if I buy you a bottle of wine with dinner tonight?" Her response, "A bottle of wine? Are you out of your mind? We don't have enough money to eat. How are we going to afford a bottle of wine?" With that, I reach into my pocket and I pull out a big stack of Iraqi dinar this thick. I said, "I have a friend." She said, "We can't tell anybody about this person. We need a code name for him. How about Alibaba?" Well, Alibaba kept us alive and well-fed for many weeks after that to keep our project of reporting going there. After eventually leaving Baghdad, we then went on to Saudi Arabia to wait the American troops to liberate Kuwait and kick the Iraqis out of there. It was a long wait. It took several months. While we were there, some Saudis that I had met invited us to their family farm for dinner one night. Picture the scene, the desert sand floor covered in gorgeous Persian carpets, a lamb roasting on a fire spit in front of us. As we sat around that fire pit on cushions, they discussed everything in the world, including what the Americans might do and what the landscape would look like going forward. But as we talked, suddenly Scud missiles flew over top of our encampment, over towards Riyadh, the capital, in the distance. Obviously, the Iraqis were trying to get at the Americans before they launched that liberation. The liberation, of course, finally did take place. As I said, it took months, and it was a huge feather in the cap of George H.W. Bush. But that victory was short-lived in hindsight. George H.W. only lasted one term in office, and he was replaced by a little-known governor over there named Bill Clinton. I was in Little Rock on election night. When victory was declared, I had a sleepless night, tossed and turned, and finally in the pre-dawn hours, gave up and decided to go to the gym. I was the only one there, and I was pedaling away on my exercise bike when suddenly I sensed somebody else coming into that room, getting on a piece of equipment nearby. It wasn't just anybody, it was Bill Clinton himself. We had a terrific chat. Too bad my camera crew wasn't there to record it. You know, Bill Clinton's presidency was almost ruined by that affair with a nice Jewish girl named Monica Lewinsky. But he really did try his very best to get peace going between the Palestinians and the Israelis. In fact, in the fall of '93, I witnessed an amazing event on the south lawn of the White House. There, Yitzhak Rabin, Yasser Arafat, and Bill Clinton all shook hands for peace. It was quite a moment. There was an air of excitement. People wondered, could this finally be a breakthrough in all of this? Shortly after that historic handshake, I was dispatched to the Middle East to get the opinions of regional leaders there about what was going to happen potentially in the future. We started that tour in Alexandria, Egypt, at the opulent presidential palace of then Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. Obviously, Mubarak isn't in that opulent setting anymore. He's in prison. But after the interview with him, he actually helped us to get an interview with Hafez al-Assad up in Damascus, Syria. He was buddies with him. And this was quite a coup for us to get this interview because Assad hadn't talked to the Western press in years. Onward, we went to Jordan and spoke with King Hussein and finished that tour in Jerusalem, interviewing then Israeli President Shimon Peres. It was quite a thrill to meet him because he was the last founding member of the modern state of Israel. All of them were rather optimistic about what could be, well, except for old man Assad, who was quite blindsided by this sudden dialogue. But after 8 years, Bill Clinton did get the Israelis to sign on to a peace accord. Not so fast with the Palestinians. Among other things, Yasser Arafat couldn't get anybody to agree to a Palestinian's right of return. So here we are today, 24 years later after that historic handshake. What's changed? Frankly, not much. Next up in trying to deal with that issue was George W. Bush. And at the time, Israel was about to give back parts of the West Bank and the entire Gaza Strip. We were sent to Gaza to interview Israeli settlers and the local Palestinians to get their thoughts. The settlers, of course, were up in arms about this. They didn't want to give up and move, but knew that they would be forced to. Many of those that we interviewed had been through this once before. You see, they lived in settlements in the Sinai Peninsula, which, of course, the Israelis had given back to Egypt. Now, here they were again, faced with the same dilemma. They knew that they had to leave, but again, weren't happy. Palestinians, of course, had a glimmer of hope. They hadn't had much hope there. I can tell you, being in the Gaza Strip, the conditions were awful. Raw sewage in the streets, crowds teeming everywhere. But as I looked around, I saw potential there. Maybe develop it as a port city or develop the beaches along the coast into perhaps resorts. But of course, in the 24 years, nothing has happened there. It's still in chaos, and we see this turmoil now coinciding with the 70th anniversary and all the violence there. But it was also during the George W. Bush administration that I covered the Iraq War for CBS. That was brought on by the September 11th attack on America. That September 11th morning, I was at the White House, watching in horror as I saw the Twin Towers crumbling on the TV monitor. I had no idea that a few minutes later, just down the road and across the river in Virginia, the Pentagon would come under attack. Suddenly, the Secret Service came running into the press room, screaming to evacuate, run, get out, now. We did. We ran out the Northwest Gate, over into Lafayette Park, where we watched people leaving nearby office buildings, desperate to get home to loved ones. It was a terrible day in Washington, a terrible day in New York, and I'm sure a terrible day wherever you were living around the country or here in Mississippi, feeling quite helpless at watching the scene unfold. Soon after that terrible day, I was dispatched to New York on a pool trip with just a couple of reporters to Ground Zero on an unmarked FBI jet with then Attorney General John Ashcroft and newly appointed FBI Director Robert Mueller. Don't forget, Mueller had only been in the job then for a a couple of days when that attack happened. When we got to ground zero, I stood beside the two of them, along with then Mayor Rudy Giuliani, next to a still smoldering piece of steel infrastructure of what once had been the World Trade Center tower. Nearby crews were sifting through the debris at a feverish rate, looking for whatever they could find. From there, we went to a secret FBI garage location on the West Side Highway of Manhattan. There, a nerve center had been set up with about 1,000 FBI agents and others sifting through clues to try to figure out who perpetrated this heinous act on America. And after those briefings, we boarded helicopters and went round and round ground zero, looking straight down into the debris. It's an image I will never, ever get out of my mind. On the way back on that same FBI jet, Attorney General Ashcroft sat there silently, but Robert Mueller looked at me and one other person and said, "Off the record, I just need to talk about what we just saw." And I said, "Mr. Director, we were all devastated by those images." Soon I was back to the Middle East after Congress declared war on Iraq, but this time I was sent to Kuwait for 5 months, covering the lead up to the war and the war itself. And while there, I reconnected with a Kuwaiti businessman that I had met in the first Gulf War. He used to invite me to his men's club meetings there. In Arabic, they were called diwaniyah, maybe similar to men's club meetings this community has. The women had their own separate meetings, maybe similar in Jewish tradition, either Hadassah or sisterhood. The meetings were held with a group of very educated Kuwaitis. You see, they went to university in England or the United States. They discussed everything, what the Americans were doing, what the Iraqis were doing, what's going to happen in the future, of course. And much to my surprise, they discussed Israel. And they were very favorably disposed to leaving Israel alone, perhaps doing more trade with them. After all, business is business, and Israel does a lot of business with the Muslim countries, including Saudi Arabia. Much of it through back channels, but it is done. One thing that they imparted to me, these Kuwaitis, was that once Saddam Hussein was out of there, the real bloodbath would begin. You see, they understood the differences between the Sunni and Shia communities. It was also during the George W. Bush administration, I went with him to Moscow on Air Force One, where he was going to meet with Vladimir Putin. This wasn't the first time that George W. met with Putin. Early on in his presidency, he met with him, and after that first meeting, he went on camera to the American public and said he had looked into Putin's eyes and found him to be a trustworthy man. Well, of course, conditions or relations had deteriorated a lot in those interim years. And on this trip, George W. was going to meet with Putin at his dacha outside of Moscow. When we got there, it was a very lavish place behind high walls, heavily forested area. Regular Russians could never imagine what lay behind those walls. At the photo op inside, there were just a few pool reporters with me. The two leaders were seated in chairs in front of a fireplace, cameras clicking away. When the opportunity presented itself, I called out, "Mr. President, do you still trust President Putin?" Well, with that, the Russian press handlers started yanking the pool out of the room. They didn't like that question, but as George W. decided to respond, I was being led out of the room by my elbow. President Bush leaned over the side of his chair, locked eyes on mine, and said, "Nice try." With that, Putin started laughing as he clearly understood. It was also during President Bush's last year in office, he went to Israel for then the 60th anniversary of that nation. There I was next to Air Force One on the tarmac for a very nice arrival ceremony. And I thought to myself, you know, you've seen ceremonies like this all over the world in umpteen different countries. But this struck me as rather special. thinking about the accomplishments Israel had made in its first 60 years, and of course now it's 70 years. And in 2008, Barack Obama became our first minority president, and he too tried to pick up the pieces in the Middle East. In fact, I was with him on his first secret, unannounced Air Force One trip to that region of the world. We had been in Istanbul, Turkey, on a state visit, and on the last day of that visit, I was in the press pool, and I had duty to be on Air Force One to bring the president back to Washington. We took off from Istanbul Airport, and I looked out the window. Noticed the sun was in the wrong direction. We weren't heading west towards Washington. We were heading east. I wondered where we could be going. Could it be Afghanistan or Iraq? I wanted to check the monitors inside the Air Force One cabin to see the positioning of Air Force One, but the military, of course, turned those off for operational security. So for about an hour and a half, we flew east. Suddenly, Air Force One banked to the right or south. I looked down out the window again and I saw a great river below. Could that be the Tigris or Euphrates? We must be going to Iraq. Air Force One started lowering in altitude, but the military put it in what you would call a corkscrew landing. Believe me, that was a dizzying effect, but I understood that the military was trying to avoid any incidents with surface-to-air missiles, as Air Force One, of course, would be a mighty tempting target over the horizon. Just before landing, the press secretary came back and confirmed that we were going to Baghdad, and President Obama was going to go to the so-called fortified green zone in Baghdad to meet the Iraqi leadership and then go talk to American troops. We got on the ground, plans changed rather quickly because suddenly we were enveloped in a ferocious sandstorm, the likes of which was something like out of a Hollywood special effects movie. You really couldn't see this far in front of your face, so there was no way that Marine One and the other helicopters could take off in that. So the Iraqi leadership came over to see President Obama at Camp Liberty. You know, Obama and other leaders have had more ceremonial trips. Apropos to this past weekend with the royal wedding in London, I remember when President Obama and his wife Michelle went to go see the Queen of England. Michelle Obama violated royal rules of protocol there when she decided to hug Her Majesty. The British press was all aflutter about that. Frankly, the Queen didn't seem to mind at all. Obama, of course, along with other leaders, have taken poignant trips, like the time we went to Normandy for the 70th anniversary of D-Day. That was a very emotional thing to watch, I can tell you from the sidelines, to see Obama and the other leaders walking through thousands of grave markers there, row upon row. The impact of seeing that was really incredible. As I said, very emotional. After Obama and the others left there, I took the opportunity to go in there. The park was closed at that time. And I walked some of those same rows, lost in my thoughts. Only this time when I walked those rows, whenever I saw a Star of David marker, I would stop and lay a stone on that marker as per Jewish tradition in a grave site, thinking about their sacrifices and everybody else's there, of course, but in the case of those soldiers, the fact that their families may never have been able to get there to honor their loved ones in that tradition. You know, I've covered lots of wars and military incursions around the world, in fact, 6, both Gulf Wars, Somalia, the Balkans, the ouster of Manuel Noriega in Panama, and the Civil War in El Salvador. Many of those stories were very hard to be eyewitness to. I remember having to see the aftermath of the terrible tsunami in Thailand, where I toured with then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. And I'll never forget going to Haiti. I was one of the first reporter teams in there because we flew in with the search and rescue crew. When we landed, we saw thousands of bodies laying in the streets. people desperately looking for loved ones, children screaming out for their parents. It was heartbreaking to see. One little glimmer of hope was to see an Israeli plane, ironically, landing there with teams of doctors and nurses setting up mobile field hospitals to help the survivors. Israel was one of the first countries, or the first country in there after the Americans, and when you consider the distance, that was pretty amazing. Jewish Federation, since they're one of the sponsors here tonight, I should give a shout out to, because they put out an APB to raise funds for those desperate people, just like they've raised funds for natural disasters in this country, including the hurricanes. And you here in Mississippi know all about what happened back in Katrina and other incidences, something we should all support, of course. Living conditions in Haiti were absolutely terrible. Little food, little water, little shelter. We were sleeping on the ground in sweltering heat. Of course, there was no bathing. After about a week of being there, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came to survey the damage, and CBS asked me to go interview her. When the secretary saw me, she extended her arm and hand to shake mine. And I said, "Whoa, Madam Secretary, trust me, you do not want to shake my hand." She looked at me kind of quizzically, "Why not?" And I pointed to my hands and my torso and lower legs, and I said, "Look at me, I'm covered in filth." She chuckled and clearly backed up, understanding the situation. Haiti wasn't the only place where I saw terrible suffering. In Somalia, I saw people really starving to death due to clan warfare. It was one of the most dangerous places I'd worked because everybody had weapons there, and we didn't, of course. The American military went in there and stopped that starvation by getting the food supply chain going again. And it went very well, a look-good, feel-good mission for them, until it all came to a grinding halt after something you may remember called Black Hawk Down, when an American military helicopter was shot down and all but except one, as I recall, of the crew on board were killed. Their bodies dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. It was a terrible thing there in Mogadishu. And soon after that, the American troops left that country. And today, all these years later, it's a country in absolute chaos. I also saw the aftermath of the Balkans genocide. Nearby European countries who used to vacation along the Croatian coast nearby did nothing to stop the bloodshed there. Again, it was the American troops who went in there and saved the Muslim population. I was dispatched to Tuzla, Bosnia, the second largest city there after Sarajevo, for 2 months. There was a dusk to dawn curfew when I was there. It was only lifted for one night, Christmas Eve. And on that night, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go to Christmas Eve services with him at the one and only church in Tuzla. I said, sure. We got there, and the place was jam-packed with thousands of mostly young people. I said to my colleague, these can't all be Christian Bosnians. They must be Muslims that just want to get out because the curfew's lifted tonight. Sure enough, 2 young men were sitting in front of us who obviously understood English, and they piped up, yes, we are Muslim, you're right, and we just wanted to get away from our parents tonight. One of them decided to practice his English with me. He says, tell me, are you Catholic or Protestant? I said, well, actually, I'm Jewish. He looked at me. Jewish, I never met a Jewish before. I said, well, now you have. My name's Jeff. Nice to meet you. He paused for a moment and looked up at me again, and he says, tell me, is it true the Jews have all the money? I said, no, of course not. I wondered where he'd gotten this from. There hadn't been Jews in that part of the world in the Balkans for decades. This must have been passed on generationally. It wasn't the only place where I experienced anti-Semitism covering stories overseas. 1990, I covered the first free parliamentary elections in Lithuania when they broke away from Russia. We covered a candidates forum there, 9 candidates. One of those 9 candidates, much to my surprise, was a Jewish Lithuanian named Emanuel Zingeris. Really amazing when you think of it at the time, because Vilnius, or Vilna as it was called in World War II time, had a Jewish population of 100,000 people. Now there were less than 3,000. After the forum, we decided to interview people about and ask them about what they thought of the democratic process, and one after one ignored that question and instead told us why they wouldn't vote for that Jewish candidate. They said the Jews this and Jews that. My heart sank listening to that. You see, I'm the son of a Lithuanian Jewish mother whose family was killed in that country in World War II. Last September, I went back there on a roots trip with my mom to the country of her birth. While I was there, I asked about that candidate. Turns out, in spite of what was said about the Jewish candidate, he was elected to Parliament. And 27 years later, a very prominent member of Parliament still. On that same trip, I went with my mom to her hometown of Trakai, a beautiful place, a series of lakes and sailboats, a castle on an island in the middle of one of those lakes. But sadly, not far from that bucolic scene in 1941. Our family was murdered there, not by the Germans, but by the locals. We found the spot, a mass grave in a forest on the edge of town, where we learned that 1,466 people were killed there, murdered. Of that number, almost 600 children, our family included. We stood all alone in that forest and said Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead. Then I watched my mom pick up a wildflower from the ground and place it on the grave marker there. She spoke to that marker in Yiddish, her childhood language, and she said her name and that she had come back. It was very hard to see. You know, anti-Semitism and neo-Nazi parties are on the rise all over Europe now at an alarming rate. But we can't forget what happened in this country last summer in Charlottesville, Virginia. Terrible things that were said and done, and the mixed signals sent from the top about what is right and what is wrong, something we have to think about going forward. You know, every president deals with crises overseas, whether it's North Korea, Iran, Syria, domestic crises like the shootings in Las Vegas, the church killings in Texas, the high school murders at that high school in Florida, and now last Friday, again in Santa Fe, Texas. But every presidential administration has one thing that keeps coming back over and over: the Middle East situation, the Israelis and Palestinians. I was at the White House, one of the last trips that Bibi Netanyahu made to see President Obama. At the Oval Office photo op, the cables were all carrying that live. Netanyahu decided to lecture President Obama about the history of the Palestinians and Jews. Obama sat there patiently. He knew that history. Those two never got along on a lot of things, including the settlement issues. But Obama faced greater problems in Washington. The gridlock on Capitol Hill. Democrats and Republicans weren't getting along on anything. And people in the rest of the country were increasingly aggravated by the situation. In fact, that may have contributed to Donald Trump's victory, because he, after all, was the one that said he drained the swamp in Washington. You know, I've covered a lot of cliffhanger elections in my time. The hanging Chad election between George W. and Al Gore, right on through the matchup between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and its surprise ending, at least for some. When the dust settled after all that, I went with President Obama on his last family vacation trip at Christmas to Hawaii before the end of his term. I had travel pool duty that day. The White House found out it was perhaps my last trip on Air Force One and that maybe I'd soon be retiring. So somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, they surprised me. And the press secretary came back to the cabin. He says, "Jeff, the president would like to see you up in his private quarters now." I can tell you, I was totally flabbergasted, caught off guard. I didn't know what I would say to the president. And I was rushed up the front of the aisle to the front part of Air Force One, and as I was walking, I suddenly realized in my breast pocket I had a bunch of baggage tags that we made up for every presidential trip, overseas or domestic. But since this was Obama's last trip, we did it a little tongue-in-cheek, admittedly with a little photoshopping. It was a picture of President Obama wearing a Santa cap, swimming in the Pacific Ocean off the shores of Diamond Head in Waikiki. When I reached his cabin, I said, "Mr. President, I've got something your daughters might get a kick out of," since they were on board. He looks at the baggage tags and starts chuckling. He says, "Forget my kids, these are great." We had a terrific chat. I thanked the president, was about to go back to the press cabin in the back of the plane, and he says, "Hey, wait a minute, Jeff, you should have one of these." So he takes out a Sharpie pen and he writes on there, "To Jeff, congratulations on a great career." That was an incredibly poignant moment for me to think about all I had experienced overseas and around the States, bits of history in my lifetime. It's hard to encapsulate all of that in a relatively short amount of time, but I'd sure be happy to take your questions about various presidents, press relations, or what it's even like to fly around the world many times over on Air Force One. But it's been delightful to be here. This is my last stop in Mississippi in a 5-city tour, and I love Ole Miss, and this town's great, and I'm so honored to be with you here tonight, so thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Questions? I know you must have some. Yes, ma'am. Bye, Randall. Thank you. Okay. Sorry? Did you ever overlap with Yeltsin? Oh, sure. I was in Moscow when the Yeltsin scene in the front of the Russian White House and the tank and all sorts of things. That was quite an amazing time. I used to go to Russia over that period, with Gorbachev and Yeltsin for about 10 years. That was the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour days. And in that company, I would go for 6 or 8 weeks a year. There wasn't the daily deadline pressure, so we could do really in-depth documentary-style reports. So I really got to know things there and developed, as one of our guests here knows, how tumultuous that time was and exciting at the same time. But yeah, so I'm quite familiar with that time period. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
The press have press secretaries that they talk to. I'm imagining that you were involved. Can you tell us what you think about the present way that our government is talking to us through their press secretary and how it compares to others that you have seen? And because you've talked a lot of First Amendment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, all press secretaries in sort of the PR realm of things are there to protect their person, their boss. So there's this tug of war, or has been a tug of war, with the press and press secretaries for access to cover events in the Oval Office and other things, include Democrat and Republican administrations. But the tug of war this time is very much public in a different way. I've never experienced it quite this way, but in fairness, it has happened, and the press corps has battled mightily to get access to cover things before. What's very interesting is in the Trump administration, he doesn't have traditional press conferences like other presidents have had in the East Room, in a more formal event goes on for an hour. But he has been very accessible in these Oval Office or cabinet room sessions, and will go on and on and on, maybe not always to his benefit, but he has been accessible. So that's been good. Many press secretaries are not told a lot of information on purpose, so they can't be caught in certain things. Sean Spicer, I knew in the old days when he was a flack for the Republican National Committee, and he was quite good at what he did, no issues, and this was a very difficult situation for him, and he never could recover from it, because if you lose the confidence, of the press corps at the beginning, that it just doesn't work going down the road. So he got caught up in a very difficult situation with the front office must from upstairs, and snowballed into Saturday Night Live and so forth. And that was, it's hard to correct from that. Yes, sir.
The Obama administration, the press was very critical of him as well. There was a book called The Stranger.
Right.
That was very critical of Obama and how he communicated his message.
Right.
And so what's happening today seems nothing new to me, except it's more aggressive.
It's more aggressive. I think that's the difference. As I said at the beginning, people were criticizing the press corps before. If they would stand up to them and take them on and say, we have a difference of opinion here, and say, here's why. But this is very different, being called out by name or the organization, or it was never that type of ball playing in previous administrations. But nobody got a free pass. If there was something that they disagree with, you knew about it, you heard about it.
Do you envision a course correction, or do you think this is the new status quo?
I think it's the new status quo. Unfortunately, it's been very difficult, and it's a whole different situation for the press corps covering this because of Twitter, for example. It's never ending because you never get to go home, because it just, in this very unusual new style of communicating, we never had presidents doing that before, all hours of the night. So the news cycle just never dies down for a couple of hours. So that's a very different method, and it's caused, everybody to, work even harder than everybody normally does. But it's a new challenge using new media that way, as in the case of Twitter. Yes, ma'am.
So sort of a follow-up, and I sure hope your answer is not nothing. Is there anything that gives you hope in terms of the relationship between the press and the American public right now?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's a continuing downward trajectory, or do you think trust between the press and citizenry will return?
I think Americans are overloaded with all sorts of images and messages because of blogs and new media sites. I've said this to other groups this week. I think as consumers of the news, you need to really look at a lot of different sources. We don't know who's writing these blogs. We don't know if things have been sourced independently with different people for the same information. There's agendas out there. The cable news network landscape, I've said, I think has ruined the landscape because their lines are blurred, especially in the evening hours, of what's news and what's opinion. And I think some people lose sight of that. I long for the days when some of us, depending on our age, you watched Walter Cronkite or Huntley Brinkley. That was the one blast of news you got a day, other than your newspaper in the morning with your family. It's very cool to have news instant and immediate, but I think things are getting sloppy because everything's breaking news and they're trying to outdo each other. And I don't think things are looked at as carefully before they go with the story. And so I think it presents problems. As a consumer of news at home, the public, I think, needs to be a bit leery of certain things and just take a breath or stop watching cable nonstop and, research things and look at different sources before just saying, okay, that's it. Again, I know my nephew's about 30. He looks at the internet all the time, doesn't read newspapers, won't watch a traditional evening newscast. And he'll tell me about this and that. Where did you get it? Oh, I read it on the internet. Well, who wrote it? Who are these people? And I think we all need to be cognizant of that. And here in the journalism school, if any of you are in the programs here at Meek, I think you are the future of shaping this and being mindful that, you have a responsibility to, do good quality journalism. Don't do sloppy stuff because we're depending on it going on in the future. Yes, sir.
Who pays the press secretary's salary?
Oh, it's a government salary. It's there's a set.
It's through the government,
Oh, yeah.
so it's not
I mean, all the White House salaries it's all public record and, from the little press assistants and so forth at the press office. And salaries are pretty low in a lot of those levels, actually, yeah.
so the press secretary is actually, she's a government employee.
Yes, yeah. Yes.
Of all the presidents, who were you most sorry to see go?
I mean, every president's very different. You're up close and personal with them, so you get different impressions. Some presidents are, easy to get to know. I think the important thing is access and being able to chat with them. I think one of the most interesting presidents that way that you could always throw a question to, no problem, was Bill Clinton. Because he, whether you liked him or not, intellectually, he was a very sharp guy and could mix it up in one moment with the Nobel Prize physicist and then, a city bus driver and connect. His people, press operation, never worried about the press throwing a question at him impromptu, at a shaking hands at a rope line at an event. Other presidents, George W. Bush, they were deathly afraid of microphones being near him. So, the cameramen, soundmen, they have these big boom microphones that they hold over and can pick up. They refused to let us have microphones near him at those howdy-do things because they were afraid something weird was going to be said. So that was interesting. But Clinton, you could get total access, and he just could talk about just about anything and have everything all straight and not have to retract the comments. So that was amazing. We had very little interaction that was Ronald Reagan because that was the end of the second term, and I think he was starting to have problems. And his wife was very protective of him, and he had some hearing problems, and you just didn't get the same interaction that we did with all the other presidents, quite frankly. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Somebody says to me fake news and I get this view. Hey, tell me about fake news.
Well, again, it goes back to we can be easily manipulated through blogs, Facebook, all sorts of things, and that's why we have to be careful. But we have to be careful, and yes, there have been problems.
Aren't you fighting an uphill battle because you've got to be right? Because you'll pay the price more than the politician who can retract it and say I made a mistake? You can't.
Well, people do. They do retractions if something, they do. You see that in the newspaper, sections in the New York Times including, and sometimes people will go on the air and say this has been, incorrectly reported. But you don't want to be in that position if you can avoid it, of course, and that's quite an embarrassment. But there have been problems over the years, of course. Anybody else? Sure? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for having me here tonight. Great audience.